So I would also like to start today by thanking the Dean's Office here in the College of Liberal Arts at Penn State. Our Associate Dean, Richard Page, and our Dean, Clarence Lang, provided support for this workshop. And I would also like to thank Okim and Kevin for presenting today. And I'll briefly introduce Okim and Kevin, and then I will hand it over to them for our workshop today. And so Okim Kang is a professor of applied linguistics and director of the Applied Linguistics Speech Lab at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. And her research interests include production and perception, L2 pronunciation and intelligibility, L2 oral assessment and testing, automated scoring and speech recognition, world Englishes, and language attitudes. And she's had numerous publications appear in outlets such as the Modern Language Journal, TESOL Quarterly, Studies in Second Language Acquisition, and Applied Linguistics. And her research has also been funded by many organizations, including but not limited to the British Council, ETS, IELTS, Duolingo, and the National Science Foundation. And she is currently the PI on a National Science Foundation project called Collaborative Research, Second Language Speech Production, Formulation of Objective Speech Intelligibility Measures, and Learner-Specific Feedback. And our other presenter today is Kevin Hershey, and he is a doctoral candidate in applied linguistics at Northern Arizona University. And his interest lies in the intersection of second language pronunciation and language technology for both pedagogical and linguistic research purposes. His dissertation examines the effects of individual differences of mobile assisted pronunciation training for English learners. And he has taught English and French as a foreign and second language on 3 continents, and for the past year has served as research assistant for the joint National Science Foundation grant with Northern Arizona, Penn State, and the University of Texas at Dallas. So we have 2 world-class scholars and teachers with us today, and I'll just turn it over to Okim and Kevin.
Thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, I see Colleen as well. Thank you. This is such an exciting opportunity for us. We've done quite a bit of studies on intelligibility, and we've been trying to promote the interplay between researchers and teachers in the classroom. And we hope we could share some of our findings and our suggestions with everyone here. This is the agenda. We'll kind of prepare the 2 sessions. So the first an hour, we'll try to go through some research aspects of it, starting with speech constructs and intelligibility and some research findings, especially something about the mutual intelligibility, characteristics of intelligible speech, and some specific instruction related issues. And Kevin's going to share our current ITA research project with some findings. And then we'll like to have about 5-minute break. And then we'll resume for our second session, which would be more of the activities. So we prepared some activities for the breakout sessions and etc. All right, so what is accent exactly? I mean, we talk about accent all the time, and that's why we often talk about the intelligibility as well. Everyone has an accent. We know most people are interested in accent. People can tell whether someone is speaking with an accent almost immediately, even a couple of seconds, even if we are listening to the sound backward. So we use accents to make judgments about other people. Accent is a distinctive mode of pronunciation of a language, especially when it's associated with a particular nation or local regions or social class even. And I've been doing some research on the stereotype related to accent as well. It can be defined as a phonological difference from a local norm. So like I said, we all have accents. That's such a familiar term for us. However, Now we have a new perspectives toward English, as we know. I'm sure here many teachers, you've heard about mutual intelligibility. It becomes a key issue for successful communication, especially in the global context. So the goal of global intelligibility is emphasized over just a particular native accent. And the ownership of English doesn't belong to just the inner circle countries anymore. So we are familiar with this concept now. At the same time, we use the term international English or English as an international language. Why? Because we know the number of English users in the world changing. So there are far more non-native speakers than the native speakers we know. And also in terms of English proficiency test, scholars have been arguing that we need to incorporate other varieties of English into this actual language testing. And I've done some research on this topic as well. And we would like to argue that, having more different varieties of accents will expand the ecological validity. So what is the speech construct? Like I said, I'd like to start with the speech construct first, then move on to the actual intelligibility. So in second language speech, we often talk about these three constructs. Many of you might have heard of these terms. Comprehensibility is perception of how easy it is to understand an utterance. And accentedness is the perception of how different a speaker's accent is from that of first language community. Intelligibility, today's topic, is how much the listener actually understands of this intended message. As you can see from the Venn diagrams on the right, all the intelligibility and comprehensibility are closely related. You can see the overlaps, but it's not a one-on-one correlation. And especially accentedness or accent is particularly independent, somehow the partially independent of each other. This construct definition is still an ongoing agenda, and my research team is also interested in looking at these constructs a bit more. Once again, accent refers to phonological difference, and comprehensibility is more of that about listeners' effort, whereas intelligibility is the extent to which listener understands the utterance. The figure on the right is a very famous and well-known research finding done by Deng and Monod, their seminal work in 1995. As you can see from the graph, ratings of utterance with 100% intelligibility confirmed by a transcription method. So you have like 9 speakers. But when you look at the accentedness ratings from 1 to 9, it's everywhere. So as you can see, you could have a strong accent, but your speech can be completely intelligible. And I'm sure we can relate to that. However, regardless of these findings, learners' perceptions are quite different. So many learners, I'm sure we have these issues with ITAs as well. They still prefer to model native speakers, especially from the prestigious model, like a American accent or British accent. And the majority of learners consider speaking with perfectly native pronunciation. So they would like to be like a native speaker still. That becomes their desirable goal. And according to some of my studies done a few years ago, students are very, very dissatisfied. Like they are not happy about their current pronunciation instruction. And sometimes teachers' models. Therefore, scholars argue that the pronunciation instruction should be moving toward setting up an international version of English, which means more realistic goal. That means it's not like a native speaker accent, but their own, but clear, intelligible accent. All right, so let's move on to the next part of the presentation, which is going to be intelligibility itself. I'd like to teach this out from 3 sections, like I said. And first, start with mutual intelligibility. What does it mean by a mutual intelligibility? Many people are trying to define or redefine the construct of intelligibility. And we know being intelligible is not the same as being accent-free, right? So here, intelligibility does not reside solely in the speaker or just the listener, but rather in an interaction between the two. And intelligibility can vary according to the audience. And some of my research studies often show that listeners' backgrounds or their bias can relate to intelligibility. So this is like one of the studies I've done quite some time ago. We know listeners or readers are so subjective. So our background factors or attitudinal factors play a role in our speech evaluation. So according to my studies, up to 18 to 23% of the variance in our speech, our listening judgment can be contributed to our own background factors. And those background factors can include whether you are native speakers or non-native speaker, the speaker's native status, whether you have a teaching experience or no experience. If you have a teaching experience, oftentimes we tend to be linear according to some of the research studies. If you have a negative experience with the non-native speakers, especially, they seem to be extremely strict and harsh on their ratings. Other issues, if you're familiar with the accent, you tend to have some different judgments. If you received some kind of radar training, also that seems to affect your own judgment. So as you can see, listeners can be affected by various factors. It's not just straightforward. On the other hand, we as teachers may bring up these issues, but when it comes to our learners, they often think native speakers' judgment is everything. So they very likely tend to complain or blame themselves. I'm the one who has the accent, it's my English, that's the problem. But like I said, and what we are trying to argue, and I'm sure some of you could agree here, the actual problem is not just speakers or learners, but the listeners. So I've done quite a bit of studies on this topic as well. And my recent PhD student who just finished her dissertation last week, she looked at these aspects, listener-speaker communication, and she's especially asking a question like, who is responsible for ensuring successful communications? Is the speaker or the listener? In these contexts, the real life context, like who is really responsible? And how we can make our listener better understand. So that's why we have this mutual intelligibility and mutual responsibility concept. Communication is a collaborative activity, right? And we both, speakers and listeners, must share responsibility for the successful interaction. So L1 listeners can respond and L2 listeners can respond, and they could probably go through a lot of efforts to make this communication successful. So what I argue, and we agree, I'm sure, is communication or conversation is a two-way street. So the responsibility for the effective communication between native speakers and non-native speaker lies not only with the former as a speaker, but also with the latter as an active and responsive and unprejudiced listeners. Researchers have done quite a bit of work on this, and we are still doing it. There's various ways of training listeners to become a better interlocutor or better communicator. So some study was done on cross-cultural awareness, use of speakers, they get to discuss these issues together. And apparently this approach helped. Also explicit instruction. So you give a lesson to American students, like all these listeners, both even native speakers and non-native speakers, the characteristics of certain accents, and provide this explicit instruction. Or we have a term, I don't know how many of you have heard of this term, high variability phonetic training. This is a particular training, you're being exposed to various accents for phonemic levels. So, if you have problems with L and R, you constantly get exposed to those sounds, and later your perception skill improves. Structured intergroup contact activities, I've done quite a few studies on this, and native speakers and non-native speakers, they get together, have like a positive, great time, like have a lot of fun, And after that, their perception changes. They get to rate the speech and they become a lot more positive. So that was effective. My student, Kate Yaw, did another training, accent familiarity training, going through various activities, letting people rate accented speech, minimal pair activities. All of these somehow helped listeners to become a better listener of accented speech, especially. So these are some of those efforts. So what I'd like to argue and what we would like to promote is, me as an educator, as a researcher, as a teacher, I see these issues out there, but people are not very aware, especially learners. Learners think still if communication breakdown happens, it's their problem. So we need to educate learners. And that's an important part. Tell them it's not your fault. A lot of the cases, maybe, listeners have an issue. So we need to educate learners. We also have to train teachers, tell teachers what to tell learners, then start to introduce high variability training or different exposures, and that could ultimately lead to successful communication. I mean, this itself is a huge topic. I'm only putting things in a very small version, but this is just one aspect. The next part is characteristics of intelligible speech. Because of my interest in the intelligibility, this is another big area that I am very much into. What determines intelligible speech? First of all, what factors can influence second language intelligible speech? We know when it comes to pronunciation, age matters, right? Like a critical period hypothesis. Proficiency matters. Your first language matters, right? And then, of course, the length of residence, the amount of target language used. I didn't put that here, but all of those could matter. At the same time, individual differences, like whether you have more motivation, more aptitude, or are you more anxious about speaking English. According to this recent study, if you have more motivation, you definitely get to produce more intelligible speech. Aptitude, positive effect. Anxiety is a slightly more complex. Here, if you have a certain level of anxiety, that is positive. But if you have too much, of course, that's not good. So, these are probably some known factors. However, what about actual speech characteristics? I briefly outlined here, but we're going to get into this one by one more details right after this. We would like to introduce the term functional load, and I'm sure some of the people here might have heard this term, and lingua franca core, and then all of these segmental features. Those pronunciation features seem to affect speakers' intelligibility. So Janet Goodwin has summarized these aspects very nicely in her article, 2014, A Lack of Intelligibility. If your speech is not intelligible, what characteristics do we see? Often it misplaced or missing prominence. So prominence is an important factor. Or you put too much prominence. That's actually my finding too. You emphasize too many words, and that's not intelligible. Stress, lexical stress seems very, very important. Insufficient differentiations in syllable durations between stressed and unstressed. So your speech rhythm, creating unnatural speech rhythm. So you create that. Lack of clearly articulated consonants. So you have still stressed the syllable issues. Your speech rate is too slow or too fast, or you pause too much, or pitch variation. Your pitch range is too narrow. That seems to be a factor. So these characteristics seem to affect the speech intelligibility quite a bit. Therefore, I guess another question we have is like, at what point we find the speaker's speech intelligible, but at what point we don't? So we could also have an interest related to threshold of intelligibility. Of course, when it comes to intelligibility, listeners matter. Previously, threshold of intelligibility can be defined as the lowers the requirement for the effectively conveying a message from the native listener's standpoint. But more of a current argument that we'd like to argue is, at what point is good enough for successful communication? Because that's the research agenda we have. I did one study recently using ETS's testing materials, and this study was supported by ETS. We recruited 18 world English speakers. Those are all university professors from these 6 different countries, and their intelligibility level varied from high, low, and mid, and they prepared the TOEFL listening passages. And 60 listeners, 10 listeners from each of these countries had to take the TOEFL listening test and intelligibility test. This was a very big project. We spent like almost 2.5 years to complete. And then we also did some phonological pronunciation analysis for different features. And I'd like to share this only one part. What you can see from this graph, the first 6 speakers on the left, you see the very high bars, they're all from the inner circle countries. In other words, they're all American and British speakers. What I'd like you to pay attention to is those high bars from on the right, those 4 different circles. Those are highly intelligible speakers from each countries. And when my 60 listeners took the listening test, their listening test comprehension scores didn't make a difference across these speakers, as long as the speakers were highly intelligible. So I wanted to find out like what pronunciation features could determine this speech or these speakers highly intelligible. That did not make a difference with native speakers. This paper was published in Applied Linguistics, so you could look at more details there. Briefly summarized here, it looks, what we found is those 4 highly proficient world English speakers, they made about 3% of vowel mistakes, like vowel deviation, no more than 3 and 4. They made some consonant mistakes. When it comes to high functional load, which I'm going to introduce right after this, a little later, only 1 mistake. So as you can see, they can make more pronunciation mistakes, but when it comes to high functional load, vowels and consonants, they make very little. And also 1.6% mistake. Lexical stress mistake was very minor. So as you can see, lexical stress is extremely important in comparison to some other pronunciation errors. Also, they use the prominence in a right amount. Here, pace means like how many prominent words do you emphasize? How many words do you emphasize within a sentence? And here you have to emphasize only a couple. Means the content main words can be emphasized only a couple of times. Also, what is interesting is this is a common pattern with the native speakers. You tend to use a lot more falling tones, 60%, then about 30% of rising tone, and then about 10% of the level tone. It's an intonation use, whereas actually the learners tend to use a lot of level tones. So that's another issue we have. So what is a functional load? Basically setting priorities in teaching of segmental. So functional load approach refers to more of the segmental instruction. This basically means we need to rank segmental contrast according to their importance in English pronunciation. So high functional errors have a large effects on intelligibility and comprehensibility, but low functional errors don't really make a difference. So for example, P and B, pat and bat, is a minimal pair. You can immediately change the meaning. But when it comes to TH, if I say, thank you very much, thank you very much, thank you very much, everyone actually gets the meaning. So as you can see, even though those are the same segmental contrast, some of these contrasts are far more important than others for actual communication. So what does it mean? Scholars are arguing that try not to spend too much time on low functional load items. Because once again, as we know, we only have limited time to teach. Our instructional class time is always limited. So I think what we would like to say is we need to make it effective. Try to teach important ones first, spend more time teaching those. And then when we get to have a time later with a little leftover, then we could probably cover some other remaining issues. That's what we would like to argue. Briefly want to introduce what that relationship would be with actual assessment or pronunciation or speaking proficiency. So I've done some research studies on this. What I found from doing a lot of speech analysis using actual test takers' spoken responses, there is a hierarchical priority in pronunciation features. Same idea with the functional load and all the intelligibility features. Stress, sentence stress is prominent, as you know. So stress, pitch is important, and fluency is important, then segmental and tone choices. So there is some hierarchical structure there. Also, I did some extensive speech analysis by using spoken responses from Cambridge English Assessment, about 120 files, 30 files from each proficiency levels. This one was based on common European framework of references for language. So as you probably know, the part is cut off C1 and B1, B2, and C1 and C2. So the one on the left is B1, then the one on the right all the way is C2. And we looked at how their pronunciation features would differ across the proficiency levels. And as you can see, when it comes to syllable per second means like how fast you speak. Mean length of run means like your major pause, like a stream of utterances or speech between major pauses. You can see rather big differences between beginner and advanced, the left and the right, but the one in the middle is always complicated. You can't really see the exact differences. So pronunciation feature itself is not that straightforward. What is interesting though, when I did a segmental analysis, you see the red one is high functional load vowels, consonant and vowels, the segmental errors. And the yellow one, the orange one, is the low functional segmental errors. B1 level, you see there are tons of errors, especially with the high functional ones. But on the right, it drops significantly. But what is interesting is the one who got the C2 level, the highest level proficiency scores, they still made quite a few errors or deviations. What is interesting is the high functional segmental errors dropped drastically. So once again, going back to my original argument, we really need to prioritize what we teach. This is another additional speech analysis study that I did quite a few years ago. In this case, I analyzed the TOEFL test takers' responses. 120 sound files. I did a lot of pronunciation analysis for this. And what we found is all of these features are important, but what is interesting here is the main focus in this analysis was only suprasegmentals, no vowels and consonants, but they even explained more than 50% of the variance in their TOEFL scores or any of these speech ratings. So here it kind of add additional evidence that the suprasegmentals are quite important. So what do I say here when it comes to intelligible speech and speech characteristics? Suprasegmentals is important. Lexical stress and prominence is important. When it comes to segmentals, we'd like to talk about high and low functional load approach and also intonation. When it comes to intonation, in the second session, when we talk about good activities, that we like to promote, there's a discourse and intonation aspects in relation to pragmatics. So that's something necessary that we need to pay attention to. All right, so the last session is going to be intelligibility-based instruction. So how can we teach, right? So we talked about the construct. We talked about the characteristics. And what can we do about that in the classroom? What we didn't cover in today's workshop is there are different ways of measuring intelligibility and comprehensibility. So the methodological aspects, I intentionally didn't include because the focus of today's presentation and workshop is really about instruction. So why intelligibility instruction? And I would like to share one dissertation study just recently finished by one of my students, Reza Dalman. And he has done a vast amount of literature review, going through applied linguistics fields as well as other fields, and found out that there's no consensus about what pronunciation targets could improve L2 learners' intelligibility. I reviewed those characteristics, but what we found and what he found is, we talk about these features are important, but not many studies or not much research has shown the empirical evidence that in the classroom, if you teach this way, your learners' intelligibility improves or doesn't improve. There's not much of evidence. So these recommendations have been proposed, but not been tested empirically. And I mentioned all of these features. So what he tried in his dissertation, and I'm going to share a little later, is that, how fast learners' intelligibility can improve by having explicit instruction on these features. So due to the paucity of the empirical evidence, we as teachers tend to rely on our intuition more. I think many of you, and also including myself, know that lexical stress is important. So we tend to teach lexical stress, possibly prominence, possibly some intonation. But because of that gap between researchers and teachers, we are still struggling a little bit, how we can best promote the most effective approach supported by the research findings. So this is just one effort. Why intelligibility instruction? I guess there's a transition in pronunciation instruction in general. We have a nativeness principle versus we have intelligibility principle. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this nativeness principle. And traditionally in the past, we used to do this. Again, I actually have about 28 years of teaching ESL and EFL classes. I've been so stuck with the nativeness principle back in 20 years ago. L2 speech should be judged against the native-like pronunciation standard. But we know into year 2022, we've moved on to intelligibility principle. And in fact, if you look at some high stakes English proficiency speaking rubrics, you can see the terms intelligibility or comprehensibility quite a bit. Understandable speech is the goal. And noticeably, we need to present L2 accent, and these L2 accents may not, interrupt the communication. And we need to assign higher priority to those of the L2 speech that are critical for intelligibility. So pretty much what I just said earlier is going to be the intelligibility principle. Before I share the actual instructional study, I want to share this IELTS project completed 2 years ago. And this article is available on the IELTS website. So in this case, with IELTS support, we wanted to see how people change over time in an EFL context, not taking any specific pronunciation instruction. So the research question I had is, how does IELTS pronunciation performance change over 3 months period of investigation? We had 52 Korean students. They are all in IELTS prep classes, 3 proficiency levels. And thankfully at the time, it was possible to get this actual IELTS test arranged 2 times before and after. So they took the official IELTS test 2 times. Then I received their spoken responses and I analyzed them for pronunciation improvements. Again, without explicit instruction, what feature could actually improve? That was my interest. Here, what we found is, as you can see at the very bottom from my text message, here, there's no improvement for consonants and vowels. So segmental feature didn't seem to improve that fast, especially if there's no instruction. But rhythm changed a little bit. Tone choice especially, they started to use less level tones and prominence improved a little bit. Again, there was no actual pronunciation instruction in this context. So this was at least a promising sign. But then my student, like I mentioned, Dalman, did a dissertation who just completed last week as well. He wanted to find out to what extent there's a difference between the group that received the intelligibility instruction versus the group received traditional instruction. Traditional here means very much a segmental instruction, vowels and consonants. He used, commonly used textbooks, whereas intelligibility instruction, he designed specific features one by one. And we did a pre-test and post-test for the intelligibility measure. We had 60 learners, 30 and 30 in each group. And this was actually an online instruction. So these learners are from all over the world. And their actual pre-test, post-test speech utterances were rated by 10 experts. He followed Sosmasier's communicative pronunciation framework. And as some of you might be familiar with this communicative framework, controlled, guided, and communicative approaches. So this is the overall design he practiced. For the intelligibility instruction, as you can see, he had 6 lessons for 3 weeks and 1 hour in each lesson. First lesson started with the high functional consonants, and second, high functional vowels, and lexical stress, and thought group, prominence, and intonation. Whereas a traditional approach, actually this traditional approach was somewhat guided by our current intensive English program curriculum. So it was pretty common practices. Following the textbook, we got consonants and he practiced, and vowels and he practiced. In terms of the activities, in both groups, they received the same types. As you can see, here, first intelligibility group improved their intelligibility quite a bit. Good thing is comparison group improved as well, because they received explicit instruction for 3 weeks. I think that helped. But intelligibility group improved significantly more. Similar pattern happened for the comprehensibility, but in fact, only intelligibility group improved. As you can see, for the comprehensibility and comparison group, the score is pretty much the same, pre-test, post-test, 3.15. What is also interesting is this. He also did a speech analysis to see exactly what features improved before and after. The one on the left, intelligibility group, improved all of these features, whereas, of course, comparison group only improved the segmental, which is not surprising, of course, because they only received the segmental instruction. But the implication here is, what if we continue to teach segmentals? This is what they get. But within 3 weeks, experimental group improved this much, significantly, in fact. So this is an implications. Here, what I like to argue is, as you can see from my sharing, both group improved, but especially segmental and suprasegmental improved more in the intelligibility based instruction. And some intelligibility features seemed more learnable than others, seemed to improve faster. And this is a short-term, only 3-week online instruction, but it was quite effective. So that's the implication here. I'd like to wrap up my part of the presentation in the next 2 slides. Again, the whole workshop is about the intelligibility approach. So what I like to say is we need to prioritize pronunciation features based on the importance or the learnability. And again, we have probably 15 weeks, maybe pre-test and post-test or introduction or final exam. You may have 13 weeks of instruction. When you design your curriculum, I think it's so important to start with the what feature, like how you develop your curriculum, what to include. So that's going to be my first suggestion. Second, I also did a study I didn't get to share, but it's important to introduce intelligible L2 speakers as models. And we know that's even more effective than just introducing native speaker. And that gives our learners different motivation. I talked about the factors that affect learners' intelligibility. So starting to use or introduce different L2 speaker who is highly intelligible, of course, in the classroom model, and that would be quite effective as well. But we did this survey study a couple of years ago with 172 teachers all over the world, asking them whether they would like to introduce non-native speakers in the classroom as a pronunciation model. The issue is many teachers said they are not comfortable. So this is still an issue to explore. So overall, to summarize, how can we promote the successful communication? Once again, I started this presentation by saying we all have an accent, right? But we are now at least aware of different types of speech constructs, and intelligibility is not the same as accent, and the importance of mutual intelligibility. And, I think it's useful to know some of the important characteristics of intelligible speech. And based on those features, we need to design our curriculums for this intelligibility-based instruction. And those are the key parts that I like to promote. And I hope this workshop can inform your practice in your own learning or your own teaching. So after this, Kevin's gonna share our current ITA research findings briefly.
Thank you so much, Okim, and thank you all for attending today. I'm excited to share some very preliminary results from our current NSF study on intelligibility, looking at some of the international teaching assistants that we're working with, as well as some other English language learners around the United States. So let's dive right in. So currently the National Science Foundation project that we're working on is the purpose is to create a computerized system for measurement of speech features and speech perception of second language speech in order to provide teachers and learners with feedback on their speech. And there's a couple of different parts to it. I'd like to just highlight 2 of the research questions today. And that is, what are the relations between measurable acoustic features of speech and listener judgments of L2 learners' intelligibility? And how do L2 learners' speech properties change over time? Or how does the feedback from this project contribute to the progression of L2 learners' intelligibility over time? So currently we're wrapping up our 2nd semester of data collection. So we've got about 330 of our 500 audio samples. That's kind of our target goal. And we're providing feedback using both automated and human analyses. So today I can talk a little bit about our preliminary results related to 3 areas. Part of this project also looked at 30 kind of target individuals who were largely ITAs themselves in the North American context before, very successful ITAs, I might add, and they're kind of our intelligibility targets. So we're picking apart their speech to kind of say, well, what are these, what is an intelligible speaker? Then I'm going to talk about some of the relationships between suprasegmentals that we've looked at and intelligibility, and actually we'll pick that apart in contrast to accentedness. And then finally, I'll talk about a couple of the feedback approaches and compare across two smaller studies to look at what we can do with our feedback. So we looked at the speech rate of 30 speakers completing 8 tasks. And these are the 8 different tasks here. And the first task was scripted and the rest of them were unscripted. So unconstrained speech, responding to kind of an open-ended question. And we see kind of an average of 3.47 syllables per second for the scripted speech amongst our highly intelligible kind of informant targets. And then across the unconstrained speech, we see a target of 3.14 syllables per second. We do see quite a large range, though. We see 3.2 to 4.5 if we take into account one standard deviation from that mean. So we actually have quite a range that we can use as our target. And we've talked a lot, I think, in the literature, or maybe informally, we've talked about kind of these targets about what should our ITAs, what should our learners be working towards. But this is, I think, some of the first empirical evidence to say, well, we've done the studies, we've asked people the questions, and now we have some information about our speech rate in particular. So one of our suprasegmental features that we're going to work on. So next, we're looking at the relationship between suprasegmentals and intelligibility. So we have 165 audio files from 73 learners. Less than half were ITAs, but we can still kind of include them in this kind of wide spectrum of speech file samples. We had people attending or participating from across the US and from China as well. And they were rated for intelligibility and accentedness by 15 trained raters and coded for suprasegmental features. So we were looking at pause duration, lexical stress accuracy, and syllables per second. So again, speech rate, as well as perception, and trying to find the relationships between these 3 suprasegmental features and intelligibility, as well as accentedness. And I've got some plots for you, so I'll walk you through them as well. So we have here the intelligibility rating on a 100-point scale on the left, on the y-axis, and then we have 3 different plots for those 3 suprasegmental features. Let's zoom in first on our pause duration. So what we can see here is kind of the shorter the pause duration, the higher the intelligibility rating. And this is for, again, some ESL learners, a few EFL learners, but largely ITAs as well as a big group in this. And I plotted this both using a linear regression and then also a lowest regression to see if there's any potential non-linear relationships here. And we kind of see that there might be something. However, once we get a lot of data points, they kind of snap together. So we do think that pause duration plays a role in intelligibility. Lexical stress accuracy. This is not a huge surprise from previous research, from what we all know kind of intuitively that it's important for intelligibility. So we do see kind of a nice linear line, linear regression for the relationship between these 2. And finally, we're looking at syllables per second, or speech rate, one way to measure speech rate. And we have another quite nice linear regression here too. So once again, this is all looking at raters' intelligibility. So what if we ask raters about accentedness? Well, we get similar sort of lines here. They're a little bit more messy when we compare that linear versus nonlinear fitting. But we do see that across the board, these are a bit more flat. And what that means is that there's less of a relationship here. If they were completely flat, there'd be no relationship, right? And so what I did is I put these together in the same plot so we can see kind of what that looks like. So our top lines here are intelligibility, the bottom lines here are accentedness. And so when we're looking at pause duration, for example, we can see that the relationship is stronger with intelligibility than it is with accentedness. And actually that relationship plays out with lexical stress accuracy and speech rate, syllables per second as well. So we have some pretty good evidence from these preliminary results that these speech features are important for intelligibility, A, but also are more related to intelligibility than they are to accentedness from what we're seeing in these data. So I'd like to look at the third part of our preliminary results today, and that is the effects of feedback. So this is kind of two separate studies that I'm going to compare side by side, literally on the screen, so we can see what they look like. So we have pilot studies with 6 ITAs receiving instant feedback about their prosody, and then preliminary studies with 22 participants receiving delayed feedback. But that delayed feedback was more comprehensive. It had a lot more information, more pedagogical guides, but it didn't get to them in many cases 3 or 4 or 5 days later. So our instant feedback looked like this. This is a little web widget that I built that has a microphone recorder, and then the learner will speak into it and it'll say, here's the number of syllables I detected, here's the number of pauses, the average pause length, the duration, and then the speech rate as well. So when you couple something like this in a pedagogical material in a learning management system, for example, then we can give the examples of, or the instructions of, read this phrase aloud or practice it or listen to someone else speaking it, preferably an intelligible but accented speaker, and practice matching that speech rate or approaching a range of a good speech rate. The delayed comprehensive feedback had a lot more information. So it had speech rate, it had an intelligibility rating, average pause length, a rhythm index, which I won't go into today, but I'm happy to talk about later, and a word stress accuracy. So it gave kind of your current speech features as well as a target for this. A lot of these are ranges based on what we've seen in previous research, and then we're adjusting them as we learn more from our intelligibility target informants. It also included a transcript with pauses marked and lexical stress errors with a hyperlink to go listen to the correct pronunciation in an online dictionary. So lots of resources here. I question maybe it's too many resources, but we'll take a look at the effects here. So once again, speech rate and pause units or thought groups for the instant feedback were collected before and after in constrained and unconstrained speech and rated by 6 train raters. And we do see from our pre-test to our post-test significant gains in all conditions, basically. So in scripted and unscripted, unscripted and pause units and speech rate. For delayed comprehensive feedback, we had speech rate and lexical stress analyzed, collected before and after, and then coded by a phonologist. And we see a gain potentially, but only significant when it comes to speech rate. And so we have some preliminary evidence of how important that feedback needs to be in terms of being quick, but also saliency is potentially a question here. So pauses, lexical stress, and speech rate matters for intelligibility. We saw that from the pretty plots that I just shared. Related to accentedness to a lesser extent, which I think is kind of positive news for prioritizing these features in the L2 curriculum. And we do see that lower speech rates can be highly intelligible as well. So these ranges are important. It's not just taking one specific target. Looking at feedback, we do see advantages of instantaneous feedback, specifically for speech rate and pauses. We think that lexical stress might require potentially a substantially more thorough intervention to see those sorts of effects. So our next steps in the study is to continue to collect our goal of 500 audio samples, refine our machine learning and technological analyses, including to detect intelligibility, and have some sort of relationship with human perception of that as well. Analyze these files for supersegmental changes over time beyond what I've shared in the preliminary results and their impact on intelligibility. And we will make a large portion of this data set available to the public through a public corpus.
Well, one thing I would like to add is ultimately this NSF project is to develop a publicly available learner-specific intelligibility-based feedback program so that all the teachers and learners can have access to this feedback and they could instantly utilize some of these features, and they are aware of their problems. Teachers can be informed of learners' progress. So that's our goal. And students and teachers at the Penn State universities have been inevitable instrumentations for this project. So we appreciate that very much. And Kevin, is this the last slide?
Yes, I think we have time to take some questions, and then we'll do a break before the workshop section begins, right?
Yeah, Philip, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. So very interesting. And Dr. Kang, I was wondering about your student who had an intelligibility focused curriculum. And I noticed that he started off with high functional load consonants and then low. And then later on had, I think, like stress and pitch in there. But given that you had, stress and pitch as like, the having the biggest effect on intelligibility, why did your student choose to start with the segmentals instead of with stress and pitch?
Yeah, that's a good point. We actually first planned to start with lexical stress and prominence, and then segmental approach first. But that's an excellent point. When it comes to the actual instruction, learners wanted to clarify some of their pronunciation segmental issues. So we started with the stress feature to promote the importance of stress and prominence. But when he piloted that instructional framework, learners constantly asking for, oh, I have these vowel problems, I have these consonant problems, I wanted to fix those first. So it was an accommodation in between. And I think that's very important. Just like, I was arguing that we need to use intelligible L2 speaker as a classroom model. But when it comes to the actual classroom context and teachers and learners still want native speaker models. So we can't ignore that either. Same thing. As a researcher, I so wanted to promote lexical stress, but learners didn't want to take that right from the beginning. So we need to adjust that approach gradually.
That makes sense. Yeah, adjust it so that students will take it at all instead of just failing.
Right.
Okay.
So the communication is important between the two. I agree.
Okay, and it looks like we have a question in the chat too. Kevin, do you want to, or Okim, do you want to take that on?
What is this one?
I can read the question. This is a really interesting question that Okim and I have a lot of talks about, discussion.
Assess the sentence level and the real world people are communicating at the discourse level, where some unintelligible sentence can be understood. Possible context is so. I was wondering to what extent such phonological indicator still be relevant. Yeah, at the comprehensibility at the discourse level. This is the, thank you, Son. This is the exact issue that we are encountering and trying to explore more. In fact, the three constructs that I shared, accentiveness, intelligibility, and comprehensibility, the more we do research on these constructs, the more we realize that these three constructs are not straightforward. I introduced the three definitions, but they're not always that clear. A lot of overlaps between comprehensibility and intelligibility, and depending on how we measure, listeners seem to understand things completely differently. So my earlier, the instructional based research, the Dahlman, that student, he used scalar judgment for intelligibility as well as a transcription method. And 10 experts listened to the same sound files, try to use two different measurement approaches. And after that, when he looked at the correlation between the two, there was like 0.8% correlation, even though they listened to the same sound files. Once you rate that person's intelligibility using 100% scalar judgment, or 5-point scalar judgment versus transcription, made a huge difference. And there's no real correlation at all. And I totally agree that intelligibility is not only just sentence level word clarity or speech clarity, is a lot to do with actual understanding. That's why the whole mutual intelligibility matters. So I think our job as a researcher is to better develop. We need to develop a better measurement to comprehensively address the actual construct of intelligibility. And again, some people think intelligibility is far more than word recognition, right? It's just more than the utterance understanding. Sometimes it's related to interpretability. So I think the field itself is still working on this construct definitions and better provide the empirical evidence for all of these complex issues. We are aware, San, very much, and I totally see the issue as well. And one more time, even with the sentence recognition, if you just measure that at the word level or sentence level, or more than a sentence level, there's a whole different issue there as well. So I think the methodological part, like I said, I didn't include today, but that plays a huge role in this argument, I have to admit. There's another comment.
Yeah, it looks like Jennifer has a question about some features are quicker to learn than others, and how might this apply to the classroom in terms of what we teach and when?
So I actually did another study a long time ago, about like 12 years ago, which I didn't include today. I just collected 75 IEP students' speech files at the placement test and exit test. And I wanted to see what pronunciation features would improve over the semester long period in the IEP context. And at that time, I did every single feature analysis for vowels and consonants and intonations, everything. And there was no explicit pronunciation instruction. It was just like listening, speaking class and reading, writing class. Like I said, there's no improvement in segmentals, nothing whatsoever. Like vowels and consonants, they did not make a significant improvement. There was some tendency of improvement of prominence, so there was the same pattern. And then speech rate improved at the time. So I think we as a teachers, what we need to decide is, I really want to promote the whole priority hierarchical structure. So being aware of the importance of stress, prominence, and speech rate, and then importance of some functional load, consonants and vowels. So thankfully, prominence seems to improve, actually, even with my students' findings and a lot of other findings. And research shows that it's important. So I think we definitely need to introduce a stress and prominent issues early on. When it comes to intonation, I said, rising, falling intonation is important, but a lot of studies show that the effect doesn't happen right away. And also learners have a hard time understanding what rising intonation means versus falling intonation. It's a complex issue. So, and intonation is related to pragmatics as well. So that one, we love teachers to introduce it at any levels of proficiency, but requires more time and efforts later on. And like I said, segmental issues is not terribly important in terms of the hierarchical structure, but learners find that so important. And also, one of my survey studies done in 6-7 years ago, when I asked importance of pronunciation features in Vietnam with the Vietnamese learners of English, all they think about as an important pronunciation feature is vowels and consonants, because in their classroom, teachers are only teaching vowels and consonants. So for them, pronunciation means vowels and consonants. There's nothing else. So a lot of issues and factors should play around. So back to your question, how do we prepare our classroom curriculum? As a teacher, we constantly have to be aware of the importance of these features and spend more time for those. And then also listen to students' needs and incorporate them. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's what I'd like to suggest. Denise, I see your hand.
Yes. Oh, I have a quick question. Thank you, by the way. This is a great workshop. Just on one of the slides with the intelligibility and the pauses, it looked as though the shorter the pause, the more intelligibility. But in my students are many of them are from India, where I'm thinking a longer pause increases intelligibility. So I just wasn't sure if I read that correctly.
Yeah, I forgot to specify that these are pauses above 0.3 seconds. So there's a solid cutoff with the hair. So anything shorter than that, we didn't examine in terms of its relationship with intelligence.
Oh, okay, so it might have been a fluency.
Right, so it's more about fluency. So this is not exactly pause placement, but it's usually at the end of a thought group. If it's well placed, if it's within a thought group, then we know that that pause probably has more impact on intelligibility. But if we could make that curve all the way, if our pauses are too short, then yes, intelligibility would probably decrease as well.
Thanks.
Kevin, there's a question in the chat about your tool.
So this looks like along the same lines, I found that the more extended the pauses, the less intelligible the speech. How did you treat the pauses between thought groups at those junctures? Did lengthy pauses increase or decrease intelligibility? So not in the results I was able to share today, other than the feedback results. We do have these pause units. And so when we did specific training, explicit training on pause units and practice with that online speech prosody analyzer tool that really just told you the number of pauses, we did see a significant gain in pauses that were not placed mid-clause. That's a tongue twister. But for our larger data set, when we had that compared to intelligibility, we weren't able to pick apart at this point in time which ones are mid-clausal and which ones are at the end of clauses. We do have the data to do that in the future. So that is on our list.
One thing to add is a methodological issue. Us doing a lot of speech analysis. The pause cutoff, Kevin mentioned he used 0.3 seconds. And some of the speech analysis I did is I used 0.1 second. Sometimes some people recommend using 0.2 second. Depending on what your cutoff points would be, your measurement of pause numbers or length would change. So this is an issue. But we also did a study completed last year. What we found out is if you have a short, very assessment context speech utterances, let's say taking a TOEFL test and you can only talk for a minute and everyone is rushed and trying to finish it. In that case, 0.1 second cutoff can make a huge difference. In other words, every little second can affect your intelligibility. But when you are looking at some discourse level conversations or classroom presentations, which has a lot longer utterances, like 5 minutes and sometimes 20 minutes, in that case, 0.3 seconds and longer can be meaningful. So, depending on what kind of speech files you are working on, we need to apply a different pause cutoff approach. And because our NSF project using ITA's presentations for the actual practice and later real presentations, we intentionally use the 0.3 cutoff to analyze.
Yu-Chin has her hand raised.
Yu-Chin.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very good workshop and it's going to be very helpful for teachers to know how to teach students and how to prioritize the portion they should focus on to improve their intelligibility. And I do have a question about assessment. So for teaching, I think that's very good. But for assessment, I think one slide you mentioned is the mutual responsibility between listeners and also the speakers. So for listeners, I think we can try to train raters, using like maybe systematic guidelines. But also when we evaluate ITAs, we also want to make sure their speech can be understood by US undergraduate students, because these are going to be their future.
I agree. Yeah.
Right. So if our raters have been trained and then they try to be adaptive and then can listen different kinds of students' pronunciation issues. And then how do we apply this to like the general undergraduate students?
Right, right. You know, I used to be the ITA trainer at the University of Georgia. And that's how I know Stephen as well. You know, we used to train ITAs quite a bit. Back to your question, I totally agree that the actual evaluator is not only just the teacher, but also the undergrad students, because they are the target audience, right? So what I used to do at the time was, when we did the final presentation for the ITA's speech evaluation at the end of the semester, we had a couple of undergrad students participating in that evaluation process. So we created combined version. I had a rubric, my own, like having the presentation clarity and all of that. And then undergrad students had their own evaluation, and I took that into consideration. But what we need to think about here is we need to remember, for this particular ITA, what I want to provide as feedback, whether I want to focus on ITA's speech itself, or ITA's classroom performance itself, or ITA's capability as a teacher, right? So we will create a different criteria, I'm sure. And when it comes to speech, I guess we can just use this intelligibility feature-based feedback. But when it comes to their actual classroom performance or interaction with the students, we may need to come up with a different feedback. Today, I only focused on speech aspects. But to make a good ITA, there are many other factors other than just the speech. Right? So I think we as an ITA trainer need to balance this out and present something that could help ITAs eventually. But again, when it comes to the speech itself, my argument is that sometimes undergrad students can be very biased. You know, a lot of my students at the time at the University of Georgia, if they had bad grades from some ITA instructors, no matter what the speech was, they just did not like ITAs. And that just did not change. That's why I was interested in training them, giving them some good time to spend, create some good memories. And that itself changed their perception. Not that my ITAs changed their intelligibility or their speech patterns, but simply undergrad students changed their experience. And then all of a sudden, ITA speech became extremely intelligible. So it's just a complex process, I think. But I like to emphasize that today, I only focused on the speech aspects. But there are many other factors that we ITA trainers need to be aware of and need to address.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Then for those undergraduates you included in the assessment, do you train them, or are they particular group? Are they particular students to be recruited to be participate in the test?
In terms of training,
randomly collect them, or just randomly collect some of them and then just allow them to rate or just express their perception?
So depending on what kind of benefits they get, I used some of other undergrad students that I taught, and I gave them extra credits that they could sit in my ITA class, and I gave them the same rubric. Training at that point was only about how to use the rubric, but training can mean many different things, right? And that's why the assessment is also very complex. If you have a very set rubric with specific descriptors included, training is a lot easier. But if there are many other things to consider, training itself is just a lot more complicated. I did not take undergrad students' scores as a major part of my grade. It was an additional information. So if you ever consider doing that, maybe 1 or 2 undergrad students getting extra credits, you could create a separate rubric or a separate scale, whether they can focus on just speech or their body gestures or their presentation styles or the interaction styles. I mean, it depends on what you want to focus on. You could prepare something different, but at least these raters or undergrad students need to know how to use the rubric you prepared, however brief that could be. And you can make that clear. I think another important thing is if you bring an undergrad to your classroom, ITA students are not happy. They're very nervous, like why this new student is in the classroom. So it requires additional communication, you know, because this is important. I'd like to bring 1 or 2 students and they're going to provide these particular ratings, but I'm going to only use that as an additional information. It's not going to determine your grade. Something like that. But it's more of the formative assessment process rather than an actual summative process at the end, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions at the moment. We do have a comment from Denise who said that she had 2 undergrads attend the ITA class mid-semester, so they aren't surprised to see them at the final presentation.
Oh, yeah, that helps if that's the case.
They're always nervous about advisors, which is kind of funny because advisors always think they're wonderful no matter. Yeah. Don't worry about the advisor, be more concerned about the students.
Yeah. Well, one thing to share is when I first became an ITA trainer as a non-native speaker, you know, I myself is a non-native speaker. ITAs did not like it. The very first day, they saw me and said, "What? Why are you another ITA? Or why are you teaching us?" So that was a huge factor to begin with. But then at the end of the semester, I mean, I kept emphasizing, apparently the University of Georgia thought I'm a successful ITA and became your mentor. You know, so try to do whatever I do. You know?
I really deeply appreciate the feedback I get from the undergraduate students because they notice things positive and negative that maybe I didn't. Right. So I think it's really valuable.
Yeah, so I think exchanging the feedback is important. Yeah.
And that is the customer, you know, not the advisor. So
not the advisors. Yeah, I agree.
All right, so you know, we had a pretty lively question and answer, so I think maybe we can take about 5 minutes and we'll come back and Kevin and Okim can share some kind of pedagogical things with us.
Okay.
All right.
That's good.
All right. Hello and welcome back. I hope you all had a chance to get a cup of coffee, check your email, whatever else you needed to tend to. And I will just go ahead and hand it on back over to Okim and Kevin and, you know, enjoy what else they have to share.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Once again, we just want to say how excited we are. We've been doing a lot of research on these topics, and we often see there's no enough opportunities to share what researchers do with the current teachers who could actually do and teach students. So second sessions, Kevin's gonna send you 2 different Word files through the chat box, Kevin. And we prepared the 2 different documents. One is just for the activities that we will do during this workshop session. And another is more of the take-home materials. It's more of the summaries of what we've discussed and some of the resources that you might find useful. So that's the second document. The first document, especially, I've been talking about the intelligibility-based instruction. And what I would like to say is it's not like one activity is better than the other. All we are saying is based on our empirical findings, one particular approach seems effective and it's proven to be effective. So we'll just simply want to share those. So the workshop activity, what we'd like to do is Kevin's going to create some breakout rooms, and we created 2 different approaches for two different types of pronunciation instruction. You can take a look, you know, whether this is okay or, you know, not okay, whether it's going to be effective or not effective for my particular group of students. And then we'll discuss together. There'll be 3 sessions, one for the segmentals, one for the super segmentals, and one for the more of the communicative pragmatic approach. And Kevin's going to give you more instructions and directions about the activity. Kevin?
Thanks so much. Great. Yes. So we'll have 3 rounds of discussions, and I hope you don't mind. Hopefully this is the last breakout room Zoom session you have for a while, since we're all returning back to in-person learning, and we're all excited about that. So you should have 2 handouts in your Zoom chat. You should be able to download them. I'll be able to send you a Dropbox link if you can't download them through Zoom. I know that's problematic for some people, so I'm working on that as well. So we'll have about, let's try to aim for 7 minutes to discuss and look through these. So we have round 1, we'll look at segmentals, round 2, super segmentals, and round 3, intonation. And really the questions just are, what are your general thoughts? What's different from teaching learning that you've seen in the past in these activities? Does it align with the research findings that we've discussed today? And a lot of those research findings are kind of summarized in general terms in that workshop constructs handout. And then the workshop discussion handout has activity sets A and B. It also has the other ones we'll do in the other round, so don't look too far ahead in those, okay? So once again, we'll have about 6 or 7 minutes in our breakout rooms. I will zoom you away to those breakout rooms. We've got a nice lively group. When we come back, we'll ask for some highlights as well. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to send us a chat message. Welcome back. Welcome back. I trust that there was some lively discussion. We'd like to take a couple of minutes to unpack some of that discussion. If you don't mind, since we have such a large group today, if there are any volunteers to kind of talk through activity set A or activity set B, things that you liked, things that you didn't, and then how does that align with the research we talked about today?
Well, for activity A, we were noticing that the minimal pairs they targeted were, you know, the ones with a pretty high functional load, at least among consonants. And then we forgot to do activity B.
Oh, maybe not enough time.
I think Lily and I found something different. When we looked at activity set A, we talked about how we didn't feel like all of those sentences in A1, you know, a sentence like, I bet you can succeed, or I pet you can succeed. You might not know if that's a perception issue, or if it's just like they can figure out that you don't say, I pet you can succeed, right? So maybe that's not a high functional load there, right? Because it's like you can figure something else, you know it, but maybe it's not perception. So some of them kind of seem like they might work, like it's a bright night or it's a bright light. Like both of those are potential, you know, answers. You don't usually say there's no pork here, but maybe you do in a certain, so it depends on the context, right? So we weren't sure that that was such a great exercise, given that the functional load wasn't so high in some of the sentences. Yeah.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Sorry, I think in our group, I took us off the track a little bit, because my question is, how much of the meta language takes time away from content? And so, for example, if I teach a course called Pronunciation in GSI Context, and GSIs are U of M's label for ITAs, or just TAs, graduate student instructors. And so the entire course is built around phrases that are prominent in instructional discourse. What are the, what are high functional load terms? If I ask my students, what are, make a list of some of the functional load, I have to spend time defining functional load. It's like when I use the term, the difference between proficiency and fluency, the difference between intelligibility and comprehensibility. And so I have to make a decision, scrap the meta language, put it in terms, in their terminology, put it in their context by having them bring in what they think that means as an example. And so I think that what we see in textbook type activities is that they are usually, and I say this cautiously, but usually not identifiable or embraceable to our particular learner population. So that's where we went, because I was questioning the time needed to define the meta language, especially because you can read, I don't know how many authors on the attempt to define the difference between intelligibility and comprehensibility, and I won't go there. So that's where I think that's what made, I think I took up most of the time on that rather than the activity itself.
Well, Brenda, we definitely avoid meta language, but we use the meta language in our decisions about curriculum, but not with the students. Yeah.
Yeah, Okim, I'm not sure if you have another comment about that. I think we're really lucky here at Northern Arizona University. We have access to T2K SWAL corpus, which was a naturalistic data collection in classrooms. And so that's what drives the Longman grammar. So we do have a chance to go look at some of this real data to try to derive our activities from. And then when you get to things like minimal pair sentences, it gets to be really, really tricky because there's just some things that don't work. So I think that's always tension that we feel when we're trying to create activities.
Of the examples in activity set A, I'm teaching a course that's kind of the broad oral communication for ITAs. We started with super segmentals. And then what happens at the very end of the semester, there are some elective modules that we're still building, these electives. That's where I might insert a few minimal pair sentence practices based on my students that semester, because I've noticed this is a common pattern. But I would spend 5-10 minutes at the most. It's just a very quick activity to raise awareness. So I do kind of follow what your research says, that we get the biggest bang for our buck. And then as I approach the end of the semester, maybe I have a few of those days on your syllabus that are TBA, right? So then you add, oh, I'm going to do a lesson on common phrases in the classroom, and we're going to practice these 2 vowels. So I kind of view it as the elective, the icing on the cake at the end of the semester.
Also, what we see from our recent NSF project is that when it comes to ITAs, ITA has a different classes, right? It's like a more lower level ITA classes versus, advanced level ITAs. Advanced level ITAs, when it comes to their speech rate, is almost similar to the ideal native, highly intelligible speakers' speech rate. So some of the features are already good, but their speech is still somehow not intelligible enough. So I think I largely introduced overall approaches starting with the suprasegmentals and highly high functional load features. But what we need to also consider is like a very learner specific needs. And as their proficiency is higher, I've noticed identifying their needs is a little more trickier. I mean, a little more difficult as well. So that's why this whole NSF project is about learner specific feedback program. And I think that's important. And back to Brenda's issue about the constructs. I mean, we as a researchers, we constantly struggle with those definitions too. I think it will be nice to have some kind of a teacher-friendly, practitioner-friendly terms And then there are some others that researchers can just communicate separately, but still the gap is large and more effort has to be on the way. I appreciate that feedback.
Well, thanks so much. In the interest of time, I think we should move on to a round 2 of discussion. So this is very appropriately looking at supersegmentals, and we have activity sets C and D this time. We have our same questions. So what's new about these and how does it align with the research that we've seen before? If you have any questions, be sure to technology issues, be sure to let me know. I'll be happy to send them. Welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you had some other lively discussions about the supersegmental lessons. We had a question in the chat before we went to breakout rooms about our first one. So I want to talk through all of these activity sets really briefly, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So activity set A, we feel is a little bit more designed around the high functional load, the targets. And so we kind of like activity set A a bit more than activity set B, although these listening discrimination tasks and other things could be beneficial across both. Both of these are kind of classical, maybe more traditional texts that have been adapted or adopted in different ways across many textbooks, of course. So once again, activity set A, going back to the segmentals, really does focus on those high functional load contrasts. Moving on to activity set C, I don't think we'll have time for some highlights from your group discussions, but activity set C and activity set D were quite a bit different. We really feel that activity set D does a little bit better job of focusing on that perception production link, and then also those important features of lexical stress and prominence. And so we can see actually both activity set A and D were included in that dissertation study that Okim introduced earlier on about the traditional versus intelligibility-based approaches. And then I'll just briefly talk through activity sets E and F. So this is based on intonation. And once again, zooming out to that discourse level of language that ITAs might encounter, thinking about what does that mean for falling and rising tones, and how would that be interpreted by listeners? And so considering which one is appropriate, which one is appropriate, and how does that map specifically with the prominent words is what's important in our opinion. And we've seen this kind of verified throughout different studies. So lots of exciting work happening in terms of intonation and discourse. I would have to say I'm biased coming from NAU that we're working on this area. And we can share a little bit more of those results, and we'll have these activities that don't come from previous resources in a take-home handout that I'll share in just a minute. Okim, did you have a couple of points that you wanted to say?
I think this part is good. What we didn't get to do much in this workshop is about intonation and pragmatic aspects. And intonation is another area I'm sure many of current teachers are working on with ITAs, because that's directly related to their communication. And here in activity, I mean, especially the take-home handout, we intentionally included some of those activities. So although we didn't get to spend a lot of time reviewing this particular concept, I hope you could take a look at our extra handout. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to let us know. Another thing is we didn't provide a specific reference list because the document ended up being so long and big. But if you are wondering about how we prepare these activity sheets and you need more specific information about references, do contact me and Kevin anytime so that we could provide you directly by email. With that said, given that we only have 3 minutes left, Kevin, do you want to move on to round 3? And actually, can I just mention the take-home handout? Kevin, did you send that take-home handout to everyone as well?
Yes, I did. I gave a download link in case you're not able to access it through Zoom, as well as the attachment there. And please do get in touch with us. I'll put our email addresses in the chat so you can copy and paste those or send us a quick message. I hope to hear from many of you. Lots of interesting conversations and points for today. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through this round 3, but I did talk through a little bit of some of those activities and options.
So when it comes to the handout, especially, I went through these concepts so quickly. So especially the construct part. And if you look at take-home handout, also hierarchical priority and some of the comparisons between the intelligibility-based instruction versus traditional pronunciation instruction, we put those figures intentionally. So you could take a look at that for more details. What I'd like to also mention is, if you look at handout page 2, you will see a functional load chart. There's a whole big chart, that you could look at, but this is a summary version. So you could have an idea which features have high functions and which features in low function. So this can guide your decision later. And at the end, we don't think this activity is the best, but we at least introduced a couple of sample lessons for you to consider at the end. And I think this is about it because we are almost the time. Anyone has any particular questions about how to use these activities or need some clarifications? Again, if you need more resources, please do feel free to contact us anytime. And we'll give you a complete list and complete chart. So feel free to contact us. Thank you, everyone. I see a lot of comments. So thank you so much.